Welcome to the My Lotus Moments podcast, the podcast for women of color to have open and honest dialogue about experiences that we all share, from dating, relationships, mental health, and everything in between. I'm your host, Hope Coleman, a licensed social worker and mental health advocate and coach. To get more information and resources, visit the website at www.hopeinher.com. Let's get started. Hey guys, and welcome to episode 27 of the My Lotus Moments podcast. We are still in July, so that means we are discussing everything surrounding minority mental health awareness. This interview really took me by surprise because when you talk about mental health journeys, so often the focus is on the individual with the diagnosis, and very rarely do we provide an outlet for those connected to that person. In this episode, Chastity Crittenden will shed some light on the journey it took for her and her family to understand and properly support her brother who has a mental health diagnosis. Here's a little bit about Chastity. Chastity Nicole Crittenden is a Southern University graduate who majored in therapeutic recreation and minored in psychology. She grew up a military kid, yet she considers Baton Rouge, Louisiana, her home. She is a 31-year-old anxiety and stress fitness trainer, certified recreational therapist, and life coach, as well as a true advocate for mental health, especially in the minority communities. Chastity has worked behavioral health for 9 years as a recreational therapist and crisis prevention instructor, encouraging healthy leisure and recreational activities as a means of therapy, as well as educating communities, families, medical institutions, and police departments on the importance of de-escalation and crisis prevention tactics when dealing with mentally ill populations. Chastity has found healing and peace by living transparently and shares that very energy and concept with many around the world. She recently founded an outreach organization called Breathe, which stands for Begin Rebuilding Even After the Hurt, to provide resources to families, friends, and individuals dealing with the impact of mental health issues. Chastity has a true passion and purpose for people, and she hopes her story and journey not only touches others, but impacts, educates, and enlightens others of the seriousness of mental health in not only minority communities, but all communities, households, and individuals around the globe. Her motto: inhale, exhale, and heal. Let's get started. So guys, a really quick note before this episode starts. I just want to point out that the audio for this interview was not the best quality, so I had to do a little tweaking. I hope you guys really enjoy this episode because Chastity had some gems to drop, and she really truly has a story to share, and I did not want to completely throw the interview away. So I did the best that I could to get all the good information that she had to share. I hope you guys enjoy it. Don't forget to like this podcast, subscribe, and share the podcast with a friend. So if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to hit me up at letstalk@hopeinher.com. Thanks again. So it's July, and it being the month that we recognize minority mental health awareness, just share with the audience your journey through mental health and your experiences thus far.
Absolutely. And so I kind of just want to start off here because I don't know, for a long time, I probably wouldn't have identified myself as somebody who had a mental health journey per se. And that's simply because I am the sister of my brother, and he is my only biological brother, was diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenic back when I was actually at Southern. So me and my brother are very close in age. We're 14 months apart. We actually ended up graduating high school together, and he went off and went back to Georgia where our dad retired. We are military kids. But he went back to Georgia, started working out there. I went off to college. And so this mental health world was nowhere on my radar. I knew nothing about it. This wasn't anything I knew anything about. My brother was gone for about a admitted into the actual medical hospital where they held him. And, that's kind of where things kind of spiraled from there. It was like we had to start learning what was going on with him because he was suicidal at that time. And for us, that was like, what in the world? What do you mean you're suicidal? What do you mean you don't want to live type thing? Let alone being kind of a shocker for us. We're an African-American family. So, my dad's African-American, my mother is Hispanic and African-American. So, just minority in general, that's not anything we per se think of as heard of in our communities. And if it is, it's not talked about. And so it was definitely a shocker for us. And so for a very long time, I didn't necessarily speak on it. And just to be perfectly honest, because I didn't understand it. And like a lot of individuals within minority communities, it was kind of embarrassing for me. And I hate to say that, but it was. It was. I didn't understand what was going on with my brother. And in my opinion at that time, because I was very ignorant about mental health, I was just like, he's very awkward. He's very bizarre. Like, what are people going to think of him? And so it took me a while to kind of educate myself and understand what was going on. And so from that point, it then didn't become a thing of trying to hide my brother from the world, but more so me trying to maybe shelter him more so from those who weren't as accepting because, that's not your brother. You don't necessarily know him. He's just a stranger to you. And so it kind of became my mission to understand him better. And then that evolved into helping my family understand what he was going through a little bit more, helping outside people understand what was going on with him a little bit more. And when I say my brother started that journey, clearly, let's see, we graduated high school in 2005. So 2007 is really when it hit. And we kind of started trying to figure things out. And it's 2018, 11 years later, and just this past year is where I could identify this as a mental health journey for me. And I say that because I used to always feel like this is his story. I can't tell his story. It's not mine. And I just had this epiphany moment at one point in time where I felt like God was showing me how it impacted me mentally to where he could say it's not necessarily, his story isn't for you to tell, but his story is a part of your journey and your story as well. And so that's how I can identify and say, I do have a mental health journey because of the closeness with my brother and because we are so attached and, that's my heart. I love him to death. I had to understand that what he was going through really did impact me. And not only did it impact me, it impacted my mom, it impacted my dad, and it impacted our family. So it is our journey. It's his story, but it's our journey. And again, I say it took time, and I think a lot of things that kind of helped along the way. It just so happens, I always tell people, nothing, in my opinion, is coincidence. These things just kind of happened, and they happened in a way that I realized, it may have been destined, it may have been ordained, because I was in school at Southern, and my major was recreation therapy, therapeutic recreation. And so that realm, a lot of people go into like physical education, parks and recreation, and then you do have those that go into behavioral hospital settings. And I just so happened to be doing a junior level internship when these things kind of started to transpire. And so I was in, at that time, community mental health center. So it was an outpatient program, but I was actually getting to see a lot of the different diagnoses and a lot of the different dual diagnoses that people were going through. And it just kind of started striking me like, oh, wow, these are the things that my brother does. These are some of the symptoms and some of the characteristics and things that he was doing really matched a lot of what was going on at the time of my internship. And so let me tell it, when I went into college, I was going to go into recreation. I was cross-registering to do physical therapy classes at LSU because I wanted to be in physical therapy. Just transpired, all of that happened. And when I did that internship, I was like, man, maybe I really want to go into some type of psych realm. And so I just took my major, and I only needed I want to say 12 more hours for a psych minor. And so that's what I did. I went and got a psych forth to. And a lot of people are like, oh my gosh, you work nonstop. And to be honest with you, it doesn't necessarily seem like work to me. It's enjoyable to me. It's enjoyable to meet different people and their families and just be able to say, like, not only is this my realm of work, but I'm experiencing it. I'm dealing with it too, so I'm learning along the way. And I just think one of the biggest things about that is you kind of learn this sensitivity, understanding that a lot of people don't necessarily get, and a lot of families don't necessarily understand it. And because of that, I love to actually just learn and see the different people that come through the hospitals and the families, the support, and therefore sometimes, the lack of support. A lot of times, individuals dealing with mental illness, they have a lack of support. And I think a lot of times, from the outside looking in, we would question, well, where's their family? How do people just get left on the wayside like that? You get a lot of homeless people that come in, and I had to start to understand that depending on what this individual is dealing with, it impacts the whole household. It impacts their families. It impacts them mentally, physically. It's just a lot. And so I don't necessarily think you can put the blame on one person. And I think that's why I continue to do it, because I understand that a lot of people will say, it's not certain people's responsibilities, but at the end of the day, I feel like it is my responsibility, because if we all say it's not my responsibility, then who takes responsibility for people who are dealing with mental illness?
It's interesting that you mentioned that when things started to transpire with your brother, that you were ashamed in the beginning. And I can imagine being from a family of diverse ethnicities where your mom is half Hispanic, half African American, and your dad is African American. There had to be some type of conflict in the way that they addressed your brother's mental health. Can you talk a little bit about how they both responded to your brother's illness and what the dynamics were among the family at that time?
Absolutely. And again, initially, I think for everybody, it was just ignorance that played a big role in it. None of us really understood it at one point. And I will say, even now, there's differences between the way my mother and my dad deal with my brother. And I always put this out here because this is always a really big one. My mom's side of the family and my dad's side of the family too, that we are Christian people. And so a lot of times, I have a very old school grandmother on my mother's side. Those are demons. You have to pray them out, things like that. And I'm always in a state where it's this. I am a believer. I am a believer of Jesus Christ, but I'm also a therapist in my realm. And at the same time, I feel like there has to be some type of realistic aspect to this. And not to say that Christianity isn't realistic, but in the same breath, this is what I always tell people. If you believe in God, your Jesus, if you believe in him and you believe that he gives purpose to people, he has put people here to help us. And so I think it's absolutely ridiculous for some people to feel like you can just pray some stuff away. Because if that was the case, what did we need necessarily Christianity for? If all we had to do was pray about things and we never had to do anything on our own, then I think in that perspective, it just cancels out everything that you believe about Christianity. And I feel God has ordained certain people to live and walk this life with you. And so to just feel like this is something that people have to deal with on their own and they just have to pray about it and then it's done, I just don't necessarily believe that's it. You have to put work into it. You have to be able to go and seek help. If it's a therapist you need to see, if medication is necessary for some people, so be it. There's many different avenues that people can take, and sometimes I'm being honest, I get frustrated, or I used to get frustrated with my family because it was just prayer, and it's fine to pray, but what else are we going to do? Because something else has to be done. And so from that aspect, I think both my parents have grasped the concept of, okay, we have to do more than just that. And when it comes to their differences, just in terms of the minority community, I think there's a big difference. At least in my family there was, and and I've seen in other instances just a way that a mother reacts to certain things and a way that a father reacts to certain things. I would definitely say my dad was in denial a lot longer than my mom and me were. And again, it's his only son, one, and he's a man. You know, he's the older child. He's a man. My dad's a man, and so I think a lot of times initially the thought process was he's lazy. You know, he doesn't want to do. You know, he doesn't want to get better. He doesn't want to do for himself. Not necessarily understanding some of the ignorance behind it. You know, it's not just that he doesn't want to get up and go. Like, he is literally impacted by depression. He is literally contemplating taking his life on a daily basis, and that's more than being lazy, if you ask me. And so I think, you know, my dad, it took him a lot longer to come to the realization that, okay, he has a problem. And it's not just he doesn't want to work, or he doesn't want to get out of bed, or he doesn't want to do the basic necessities of brushing your teeth and washing your face and taking a bath. You know, I think from that aspect, they were very different. You know, my mother was the mother first. So at the end of the day, that's my baby. Regardless of how grown he is, that's my baby. Something's wrong with him, and we have to help him. Whereas my dad on the other end was, we're coddling him. You know, he's never going to do anything if we just allow him. If we put it off on this quote unquote mental illness that they diagnosed him. I think from that aspect, from my experience, it was definitely a lot more difficult for my dad to grasp the concept of his mental illness. But he has made strides, and I will tell you that I think the biggest thing for a family or anybody dealing with this situation is being able to find your strengths in that area. Because it's gotten to a point where we had to sit down and just say, listen, you know, I know you feel this way about it, and you feel this way about it, and mom feels this way about it. But if we can all take what we do know and put in where we can, it doesn't have to be just your sister is helping or just your mom is helping. Because I think at one point in time, that's what it was, you know. I don't want to deal with it, so you deal with it. Well, now mom's tired of dealing with it, so dad deal with it. Now dad's tired of dealing with it, and sister doesn't want brother homeless, so I'm going to deal with it. And then it became, okay, this has to be a team effort. You know, it's kind of like the concept of a child. You know, it takes a village. We can't do it one by one. We have to do it as a team, you know. I understand it's exhausting, and you're going to get tired at some point, but we need to be able to lean on each other. I think that's the biggest thing that we had to kind of come to grips with after getting over the now portion, was understanding that we can't do it alone. We have to do it together.
You brought up the idea that you and your mother and your father needed to work together. And I agree, because when you have a family member who is in need, especially a family member that's so close that, you know, essentially shares a household with you, it's going to affect the entire household. So why not have the entire household contribute to the healing of that person? Because what I found, and I'm sure you are aware of this, is that when it's constantly one person carrying the burden of attending to someone else's needs 100%, of course it's going to affect them in some type of way. It's going to affect their own mental health. It's going to affect them in the way that they can't take care of themselves. So even outside of mental health, whether it's physical health or financially. So to be able to come together and attack the problem as a cohesive unit makes the most sense. I think it's very admirable to know that your dad eventually got on board. It would be the most effective with him on board versus him not being on board. Another thing I wanted to mention to you in regards to faith. So we actually talked about this on another podcast, but faith in the minority community has such a strong hold on how we address mental illness and treatment. And for me, I believe that it is improving in regards to the church implementing mental illness, but the whole narrative that in the past, the church has pushed the idea that you can pray some things away, or you can worship some things away, or bring all your burdens to the Lord and He will take care of you. That is fine and dandy if you believe that, but you also have to realize that God gives us resources here on earth, just like you said, to utilize. And for us, I believe that we essentially deny the grace He provides to us if we choose to just ignore those resources. It's almost like the story where there's a man in a boat and he prays to God to send him help, or he's drowning. There's a man drowning in the ocean and he's praying to God to send him help, and a boat comes to save him and they're like, get on, and he's like, no, I'm waiting on God to bring me help. Okay, and then the helicopter comes, and then he does the same thing, and then the man drowns because he refuses the help that comes to him in the natural state. And so when he sees God, he says, well, why didn't you send the help? And he said, well, I did send the help. And so I think we over spiritualize things so much that we miss the opportunity to work with the things in the natural, right?
I totally agree. I will never forget, might have been maybe the first year I was actually working in my field. We were doing a seminar at work. I think one of the doctors came in to kind of go over some information, and he was talking about barriers and then also safety nets for different minorities in the mental health community. And one of the things that really stuck out to me was he made the statement that suicide rates were lower at that time for Hispanics and African Americans due to their belief in religion. And the thought concept behind it was minorities, take on this thought process. If you kill yourself, you're deemed for hell. You're going to hell. And so he said, in that regard, it is a safety net for minority communities because our percentages weren't as high at that time because of the thought of living eternally in hell. And a lot of people were like, well, that's a good thing. It keeps them from killing themselves. And I can see that perspective. But the only thing that I could grasp from that was, so we suffer here on earth because we're afraid of what happens eternally. Which in turn, me as a Christian thinking God's grace is still invalid to us if that's the reason we suffer, because we feel like we're doomed for hell. When in our Christian beliefs, we believe that Jesus died for our sins. So for me, all I could think about was, yeah, it keeps them from dying physically, but they're dead alive. You're dead here on earth. You're just existing. You're not living. You're in turmoil. You're suffering with auditory hallucinations, visual hallucinations, solely because you don't want to go to hell. And that thought, all I could do was think of my brother in that moment, because when he did finally come to a point where he verbally said, he didn't want to physically be here. And his expression of that was, it was really like hell on earth for him. So for me, all I could think was, people think it's a safety net, but so many people are just living in hell as minorities because you have nobody to go to. The church, and I'm speaking in general, not, everybody, but you can't turn to the church because a lot of times their response is pray it out, or, those are demons and X, Y, and Z, and we don't give the reality of what mental illness is. So a lot of people do suffer alone. I can only imagine me not necessarily dealing with what he was dealing with, and I was ashamed. And him having to deal with it, how much more ashamed was he? Not being able to go to anybody and say, this is what I'm dealing with. This is what's going on. I'm hearing voices. The devil's talking to me. Jesus is talking to me, and I can't decipher who is who. I can't sleep at night because I'm seeing shadows. I have these delusions of being in wars that I was never in. So you're living here on earth in a hell. And we would rather you do that because the church says, it's better than killing yourself and going to hell.
Wow, that was such a powerful statement to say. We suffer here on earth just because we are afraid of what's going to happen to us eternally. And, that is so true. And I think that people, not Christianity, but people of the Christian faith or of the church, let me correct myself, of the church, can use the Bible, as we all know have done so over centuries, as a way to keep others in bondage and use power and control over others. So when people use the Bible to condemn others when they are suffering from mental illnesses, it's almost as though, well, that isn't what Jesus Christ would do. That isn't what Christianity is all about. It feels like you are a burden to others. If you are a Christian and you go to church and you are battling depression and you're battling anxiety and you never miss a day of church, you never miss a moment to tithe, you pray as much as you possibly can, and yet you still suffer from the depression. But then you go into the church and you hear people condemn others who suffer from depression. It almost feels as though, from that perspective, that, well, I must not be doing this right. I must not be a good enough Christian. I can understand how for anyone that could be isolating, among a community that you are supposed to feel protected, and you seek a community where you seek to be healed and you seek some type of solution. I can definitely understand how that could feel very isolating, because it's almost as though you leave feeling more rejected and conflicted versus empowered. The church can sometimes refuse to create that space to offer up an alternative for healing, right? So I definitely agree how in some ways the church and religion can be a burden. It can be an obstacle to our healing, but we are so, especially minorities, we are so rooted in our faith, and that's something that we've used for centuries to get out of all types of historical moments of oppression. And then we walk into this new age oppression of mental illness, and we think we're battling the same war and we're using the same weapons. But sometimes we have to get new weapons. The same thing ain't gonna work for everybody. So it is so important that the church collectively begin to understand that, there are so many people leaving the church. There are so many people leaving the church that feels hopeless when they turn to church in moments of needs and they can't get the information that they're looking for, or they can't get the natural healing that they're looking for. So I think this is a great opportunity for the church to actually turn things around if they are truly going to follow the words of Jesus Christ and the way Christianity is supposed to be lived throughout each other.
I totally agree with that. And I just, I think that we have to, and again, like you said, things are getting better, but minority communities still have a very long way to go when it comes to mental health and understanding, and just at least trying to minimize that stigma and the ignorance. I just think that, and honestly, I don't necessarily think a lot of the intention is ill will intention. It's really just ignorance on our part, and understanding that a lot of minority people grow up in these, I hate to say bubbles, but we grow up in these religious bubbles. And so aside from mental health, a lot of times we'll condemn other religions and other people solely because we grew up the way we did, and we can't look outside of our bubble to say this is not Christianity. Can't be Christianity to condemn somebody for what they believe or what they're going through. And so I just think that the church in general has a long way to go in terms of reaching this population of individuals, especially as minorities, because being strong is literally killing minorities. Being strong to the point where you feel like you have to handle everything on your own because your own community won't take the time to understand what it is you're going through. It saddens me to really no explanation, because I really can see both sides. It's not ill will on their part. It's just the fact that we grow up with the education that we grow up with religion, and it's so hard for some people to look outside of what you've been told to meet somebody where they are in their situation. For some reason, I feel like even Christians believe that if I allow you to be mentally ill, or if I allow you to experience what you're experiencing without condemning it, am I sinning? And so I think sometimes they get caught up in the thought of, well, God wouldn't want me to tell this person that. Not really understanding that, your relationship and their relationship are totally different, God would definitely want you to reach out to somebody and at least try to understand what they're going through before you condemn what they're going through.
I think you bring up an interesting point about the stigma that still exists in our communities. Because social media has become so popular, especially during moments of awareness, we see so many people sharing their stories. We see so many people combating the very thing we're talking about, the stigma. And for people who spend a lot of time on social media, it's almost as though you think the stigma isn't there as it used to be, because we see all of the resources via social media, or we see all of the people advocating for mental health. You don't think there's a real stigma attached anymore. But in reality, outside of social media, there's still a great need of education that needs to be done within our communities, as well as within our schools, our churches, even with the older population. So what are some things that you think that we could do practically outside of social media to educate each other in the community, as well as to destigmatize mental health?
I think, I think we have to do what we do on social media. Honestly, I think it's easier to do it there. I think the thought of, and this was just something that I really had to do to kind of help me mentally. Because like I said, I was impacted by my brother. So I did, I went into these states of depression a lot of times. And I got to a point where I realized what helped me. And that was talking about it. Being able to say, hey, this is how I feel, without necessarily feeling guilt about the way that I felt. And so I want to say around December time, right before the new year, I did, for myself, I put it out there for other people, this transparent healing thing. And I think if we can start really doing that outside of just social media, because when you do things on social media, you're going to draw the population that is interested by that. So those people who are dealing with it are going to come and speak on it, Those people who understand it are going to come and speak on it. So we might be helping by telling our stories and letting other people know it's okay, but a lot of times it's the people that are going through that. So not necessarily the individuals that are on the outside looking in come to that social media post or understand that population. So being able to actually do that in the community, and maybe even helping people understand that it's not even just what you think it is. A lot of people will see mental illness and the stigma behind it, and they're going to think automatically, like, quote unquote, I hate to say this, but people use the word, the crazies, crazy. Not understanding that just about everybody, if not everybody, at some point, if we're talking about mental health, your mental health has not been what it should be at some point, and it probably isn't right now. But because we think of it in such an extreme way, there's no level or balance to it, as far as mental health. People think suicide, oh, that person's crazy. Or people think, oh, he talks to himself, that person's crazy. Instead of thinking about everyday trauma that you're dealing with. And I had to get to that point where I realized, wow, I've been so consumed with what's going on with my brother. I really started to see some of the things that I was dealing with trauma-wise. Like, this is not healthy for your mind. In turn, this is a mental health issue. Now, whether it is ongoing or whether it is severe and what maybe somebody would say, you're still dealing with mental health issues, anxiety. A lot of people don't even realize, you deal with anxiety on a regular basis because of minorities, especially because of maybe your environments or maybe, the household you grew up in. And it seems so normal to you that you don't necessarily think that you're dealing with trauma because this is your normal. And I think that's why in minority communities, you will hear so much the call to healing per se in our communities. When people are going through stuff, stay strong. Just pray. it's just so normal because that's what we've been taught to do. But the thing is, are we really healing? Like, especially as Christians, like, are we really healing ourselves? Are we really living a life of freedom and being saved and all these other things by just watching people cry out for help and hearing people cry out for help and then just saying, stay strong? Does that really help somebody? You know? And I just think that we're just, again, it's our normal. You know, we're so used to pushing through things and making things happen that when we do, if we've really done our part, because we're just so used to saying, be strong, I'm praying for you. And it's like, is that really helping somebody? Because I mean, as minorities, I'm sure everybody's praying for them. I'm sure they're praying for themselves. I'm sure they've tried to be strong and they've gotten to a point where I can't do anything else. And so I think a lot of times we sell ourselves short as a community because we think that we're helping, but and not to say you're not helping, but at the same time, are we doing enough? I think we have to get to a point where it's a lot more than just words of encouragement. And, what are we physically doing to help? Because our community, whether we want to see it or not, is really suffering from mental illness. And I say all the time, rightfully so, we as minorities have had to deal with so much just in general, just in the world alone. It would be ridiculous to believe we don't have some type of trauma or anxiety that's built up that needs to be addressed at some point.
I definitely agree that, especially being in minority communities, we have to really learn how to, yes, use religion as you please, but also don't negate the fact that there are natural resources here available to us to utilize as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think on the flip side of that, us not utilizing the resources, sometimes we have to be, and this can be a balancing thing too, because sometimes we have individuals who, you are the resource. And if you exhaust yourself, then you're going to need the resources that you're trying to provide for somebody else. And on the flip side of that, we have individuals that, God has graced us with different gifts and we're not using them. People need us. And sometimes we need to be the resource and we're not going to be the resource. And I think being able to find the balance of, how can I be, of assistance? What is it, God, that you want me to do? And I really had to find myself in a place where I had to pray about that, because a lot of times I would overextend myself, which is just as bad as not extending yourself. And so I just had to really pray, what is it that you want me to do, so that I can be at peace knowing that I've done my part. And, where other people have to be utilized, you'll do that. I think we just have to find that balance as well. So we're not passing the buck to anybody else, but at the same time, we're not overextending ourselves to where, we're going to need those resources as well, because now we're dealing with anxiety and depression because we're not, getting the rest we need or doing the things we need to do to make sure our mental health is in the right place.
As women, as minorities, we tend to try to take care of everybody else, and we continually put our own needs behind others. And so at some point it does catch up to you, and I'm sure you've heard this before. You cannot pour from an empty cup.
Exactly, you can't.
And if our bodies, they will let us know when we cannot handle another thing. So if we refuse to take that time for ourselves, our body's going to do it for us. And then we're going to be out of commission for weeks on end or months on end, or just not feeling well, whether it's physically or mentally. So I definitely agree that at some point we have to start making sure we are healthy enough to pour into others. But getting back to your brother, talk about where he is now. How is he doing?
You know what? He has progressively gotten better. My brother lives in Georgia, and he's done a lot of back and forth. He's currently in Georgia, and honestly, I saw him 4th of July weekend, actually. I got him one of your shirts, and I was really excited to give it to him, and he was actually just coming out of jail. He had been in jail, and there's always this ongoing thing, which is kind of not necessarily a battle, but it is a community thing that I've kind of put in place now is just, he ends up sometimes in jail because he has this aspect of homelessness because of his illness. He ends up in jail a lot of times for the fact that, he's sleeping in abandoned places. And so it was very exciting to see him because he looks so good. His mind is in a state that it hasn't been in a long time, which is in a positive way. He's thinking clearer. And so that was very good to see because he has progressively gotten better. Of course, he still has his battles, just from the fact that he doesn't necessarily have assistance financially. And so right now, I'm actually going to see him this weekend in Georgia, and he's going to come back with me for a little while just so we can try to get him set up with some benefits and hopefully kind of dwindle down with the excessive homelessness. And he actually had been working for about 8 months, which was really, really good. That's the most consistent he had been since about 2008. So he hadn't had a job since 2008, and then he got a job at the end of 2016, and pretty much worked that job all the way through 2017. And then he just, he had a lapse in terms of medication, and unfortunately, because of that inconsistency, he wasn't able to withhold that job. So, but as far as his mental state and where he is mentally, I'm very happy. Like, I am a waterworks show. A lot of people don't know it, but I am a waterworks show. And so just when I saw him for the 4th of July weekend, it was just like, not in front of him, but like I got in the car and I just boo-hoo, because a lot of people, for me, it's just, it's a miracle just seeing the transformation for a lot of people. And for him, it really is. From where he started, my brother was mute for a year. He didn't talk. He was just, very zoned out, very inconsistent. He didn't like the medicines. And then, we did find something that worked for him. And just to see his progression has really been amazing to see him consistently work for that period of time. And just be in the state of mind that he's in. It's miraculous to me. And I want to be able to just help other people at least find a sense of peace in knowing that, yes, maybe a family member has certain conditions, but it's not the end for them. There's still life for them. There's still a sense of normalcy for them if they can get the support and help that they need. I just recently, and this is something that has really been on my mind because, my brother's been in Georgia. He started this journey in Louisiana. He was out in Houston, and he actually did really well out there because that's where we found the medication that worked best for him. And then, honestly, when he left Houston, just depending on state to state, things are different. So, they allowed him the injection there in Houston, but they didn't have the same injection that he needed here in Baton Rouge. So that medication wasn't available for him, and we could tell the differences in his medication. And then when he got to Georgia, they didn't allow the injection at all. So it was like, man, that really worked for him. How do you kind of, fill those different voids? Because from state to state, it's just different. They allow certain things, and then other states don't. And so I really have come to the point, which was one of the reasons I did come back to Baton Rouge. I missed Baton Rouge, but Texas and the areas I was in Texas, they were saturated with, support and help. And even with the saturation of it, it's still a lot of resources that aren't available, especially to minority communities. And so I came home because I was like, if nothing else, we might not have all the resources to get necessarily the benefits that, certain people need or the housing that certain people need. But if we at least have the support, in Louisiana, in Baton Rouge, to understand, your family might have to deal with going through Social Security and trying to get that for years. But if you have the support of other people who have been there, who can share their quote-unquote testimonies, it took this long, but the 10 years that it took for him to get kind of stable, it was so worth it, and if you just have somebody to lean on, and that's kind of, I just started an outreach program called Breathe, and it stands for Begin Rebuilding Even After the Hurt. And that's just more so because I feel like that's what I had to do. I had to learn how to heal myself after being so really traumatized by what happened to my brother, because, like I said, we're military kids, so that was the only friend I had, everywhere we went, he was with me, we stay here a year and then we move, but guess what, brother's coming, so it impacted me a lot, and I had to heal myself from what he was going through, because it hurt. You know, it hurt to see him like that, and it hurt to feel like Waterworks show starts for me, but it just hurt to feel like I couldn't help him. And so, you know, I just want people to be able to feel that support, because as a sister, I didn't know who to talk to about it. And I didn't want to feel like I was burdening him by constantly asking, what's wrong, you know? And so being able to talk to other people and see, hey, you know what? Other people are dealing with this. And they don't even realize it's mental health issues, you know? You just have a friend who has, you know, another relative who burned down a house, and it's like, well, man, how did it happen? And they start to tell, you know, the things that that relative was doing, and it's like, man, has he ever been checked out for certain things? Because that sounds a lot like my brother. You know, just being able to have an outlet and say, you know, I could talk to somebody, and they might not have had all the answers, but they had some of the answers, and it felt a little better to know, you know, they said I could go here and they can help with this. And so I just think it's really important for the community to understand, you know, if you don't necessarily have access to the resources that you need, you can have access to people, you know, who have dealt with some of the same things, who might be able to share some of the things they were able to do.
You know, your story is so powerful, and I am positive that it will touch so many people and resonate with so many people who sometimes feel lost when they experience a family member who may be suffering from a mental illness. And so I just want to thank you for sharing this story, because I know for some it can be difficult to share, but I think with you telling your story and telling even the struggles that you had with either accepting your brother's mental illness or even struggling in ways to help him, I think it'll definitely help somebody else out there. So thank you so much for sharing your story. It has touched me in a way that I hadn't even really imagined it would. And simply because, you know, and I hate to say this, but sometimes I forget, you know, I forget how powerful the help of family can be, simply because I have an aunt myself who struggles with mental illness, and she for a very long time when I was growing up, she was one of my favorite aunts, because, you know, she was the youngest of my mom's siblings. And after some years after she had her children, I think I was maybe 11 through 13, I can't really remember, but at some point something changed. You know, she went through a bout of postpartum depression, and then there was a whole lot of things that happened. But then eventually she got diagnosed with schizophrenia, and from that point on, all throughout my preteen, teenage years, young adult years, she was in and out of hospitals. She was in and out of jail. She was homeless, you know, drugs. Her children my grandmother ended up taking custody of the children, and then my grandmother passed away. And so my grandmother, you know, when my aunt was out of jail or out of the hospital, she had a place to go to seek that refuge from my grandmother. But when my grandmother passed away, you know, my mom kind of played that role for a little while, but it wasn't as significant as my grandmother's. And so after a while, things just got worse for her. And so now I don't even know where she is. She could be in the hospital. She could be in jail. Who knows? And I just imagine, you know, had she had the type of support from her siblings like you support your siblings, I could imagine where she would be instead of where she is right now. And it saddens me because, you know, she has children and they are not connected because of her mental illness. And it all goes back to what you said earlier in the show about being there for each other. As a family, as a cohesive unit, you have to support one another, because without that support, who knows where your brother would have been? Who knows how far he would have been out of your reach? So I just want to commend you for the work that you've been doing, for the work that your family's been doing, and for you just being able to speak up about the role that you've been playing in your brother's life, and even as a vessel of education for your family. I truly believe that God is using you and will continue to use you to be a resource for others who share that story, to be a resource for people who are in relationship with individuals who suffer from mental illness. So keep doing what you're doing and keep just being available to educate others, as well as, like you said, become a resource for yourself. I think the outreach that you're doing is so important, and uh it's oftentimes a component that we don't really recognize. When people are dealing with mental illness, we tend to pour all of our resources into that particular person, and we forget that there is a cohesive unit attached to that person, and that we have to provide resources and fulfill the needs of those attached to that person as well. So thank you for doing what you're doing, and just continue to share your story and be a vessel for those who need it.
Thank you. Thank you. I love him to death, but I know that other people, just our community in general, needs to know it's okay. It's okay to be in these positions and not feel ashamed or embarrassed. And I honestly think, for a Black male, I think it is very difficult to have to come to that realization, because even though I said my dad was in denial a lot longer than me and my mom, my brother was too. I just think that's it's difficult for a Black man in general to grasp that concept, that your mind is where it is. As a woman, it's difficult. I'm sure. I know it was difficult for my mom, because, like I said, that's her son, her baby, and that's a mother's love. But at the same time, getting to a point where you can acknowledge, something's not right and something has to change, and it's just a start. It's like an addict. They say the first step is, acknowledgement, accepting the fact that you're an addict. It comes to a point where you have to accept that something's not right, and from there we can at least begin to look for answers to change the dynamic. So
wow, again, so thank you so much for taking the time out to talk to me, to share your story, as well as just educate those who may be sharing some of your same experiences.
Well, thank you for allowing me to.
But before we go, are there any resources or any advice that you would like to give to those who may be struggling helping a loved one who suffers with a mental illness?
Would share some advice. I would definitely say, just in terms for individuals who may not personally be struggling with these issues, but may be in my situation. You have like a really close relative or a friend, maybe even a spouse. A lot of times people have spouses that deal with these type of things. And I would just tell you, one, be realistic. I always tell people you have to be realistic. If it's not something that you feel like you can deal with, especially if it's a spouse. I think it's a little different if it's a child of yours or maybe even a parent of yours. But be realistic with yourself and understand that if it's something that you don't think you can deal with, don't necessarily feel like you have to carry the load, of that alone. Talk to somebody. Maneuver the way that you feel is best for you and safe for you, because honestly, you can put yourself in a state that is not healthy for you, trying to be something for somebody else. And so just be realistic with yourself. I would definitely say that. For anybody else, maybe in my brother's shoes, especially here in the Baton Rouge, Louisiana area, and even family members who may have people in this situation, the resources are limited, just being honest with you. The resources are very limited. However, some of the things that we did learn, going to your local police offices and just letting them know, who the individual is. Like, we grew up in Baker when we came to Louisiana, and the Baker Police Department, they know my family. They know my brother. They know what he's going through. Therefore, if he's there in the community and they see him, they build these relationships with him. So he's not necessarily viewed as a threat per se. They know he was dealing with schizophrenia. They knew his symptoms. They knew what he might be doing. And so it would be like, hey, Q, come here. They'd bring him home, or they would call my mom or my stepdad and say, hey, we've got him down here at the station. So no, letting your community, your neighbors, the police, different offices know who the individual is and letting them build relationships with them kind of helps, because then they're aware of what's going on. That's one of the biggest things. A lot of times people don't know what to do, maybe if you have individuals in those circumstances. And it took my mom a while to get used to, but she would call the coroner's office, and she would put in a report for them to come pick him up when he was in these really, really bad episodes. You know, he might be really verbally abusive and saying things and doing things that would seem bizarre. And so, you know, we would talk to him and say, hey, Q, I really think that you need to go ahead and go to the hospital, maybe find out if we can get you back on some medicine and go from there. So being able to, maybe sometimes you can't communicate when they're in certain states of mind, but learning that we could call the coroner's office to have him picked up was a big thing for us, because at first it was kind of like, you know, initially what we did was call the police, and they came, and it wasn't the greatest situation. So once they got aware of his situation and they knew who he was, we could call and say, hey, we need you to come pick him up. We can't get him in the car. He's not willing to go to the hospital. So just being aware of those resources and ways to actually get them help in those terms have been good for us. And it's not always easy, you know. Yeah, there were times when my brother was very upset, like, you know, you called the police on me or you did X, Y, and Z. But at the end of the day, we knew he needed help. So my mom would deal with that a lot. He's going to be really mad if I call. He is going to be really mad, but at the end of the day, it could save his life and your life. And that's what's most important. So that is, you know, the little resources that I do know is just being able to communicate with your local offices and let them know so that they can build those relationships as well.
That is some really good advice. I definitely will recommend as well that you build a relationship with the local law enforcement, with the local hospital personnel. If someone that you love does frequent the hospital, it pays to build that relationship, because you just don't want that individual to be labeled as a threat. You know, because to be honest, not everyone, and we've all seen it on TV, not everyone is treated fairly when it comes to mental illness. So definitely build those relationships. And yeah, that's all. So again, thank you, Chastity, for joining me on the show. And I really, truly hope that you continue to do this incredible work that you're doing. And thank you for allowing people to hear your story.
Well, thank you so much for allowing me to, and I hope it does. I'm definitely going to continue to tune in, because I'm, looking for resources as well, just kind of helping.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the My Lotus Moments podcast with Hope. If you enjoyed this episode, share the Apple Podcast with a friend or someone you know who needs it. And please take a few minutes to rate and review the show, because that is how other people find us. And if you're talking about this episode online, don't forget to use the hashtag MyLotusMoments and tag me at JustMoreHope on Instagram and Twitter. Until next time, thanks for listening.